Share. Share. Share this video. Man, I look short. I look not as tall. Which is not, height is not a determining factor in anything. Oh, mic is loud. Mic's loud. I'm gonna turn the mic down a little bit.
What's up, bro?
What up, big dog? Happy birthday! I missed your birthday. What's good?
What you on?
We out here doing this teaching. We reading a different book every day, and just doing it on a live stream, trying to educate the community on some issues. How was Florida? You was out of Florida, right?
Yeah.
Miami, yeah. How was it?
Love it.
Yeah. Oh, my. All right, y'all. I think I got that situated. Mic a little loud, but that's okay. I'll talk a little less poignant. All right, so. Oh, no, I'm straight. Good looking. How y'all feeling? Y'all feeling all right out here? Uh-huh. That's what's up. It's a nice night. Yeah, it's a nice night. All right, we Oh, yeah.
I'm sliding back over.
Bet, I'm gonna be here. What's up?
I'm definitely gonna come back.
Oh yeah, bet. We gonna be here. We have breakfast on Saturday and Sunday mornings all month. We gonna have breakfast here 9 to 12 during the readings and stuff.
Okay.
Free donuts.
Okay.
Yep, slide through.
Okay.
I'm gonna be in tune with y'all.
All right.
All right, y'all. Y'all be safe out here.
Yo.
I love you, bruh.
Yeah, I love you too, bro.
All right, man. So they said we had 2 chapters left. So let me find out how many chapters it is in here altogether, so I can know where we're at, because I'm not sure where we are at. Sorry if I'm talking low. So 2 chapters left. Looking forward, looking back, page 177. 177. All right. There's a picture here. It says St. Louis, 1947. To construct this gateway arch, the city demolished a downtown African-American neighborhood, displacing residents to new black areas like Ferguson. Wow, it's powerful. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see the picture. It's a little darker. I'm a little further away from the phone than a few other people have been. I'm going to try to get closer. Again, we are right now, I'm getting ready to start reading from The Color of Law. This is part of the ongoing teaching at Say Their Name Square that the May 30th Alliance has been part of organizing. Here's that picture. It's black and white, so I probably ain't doing it justice how I'm showing it, but nevertheless, all right, let's begin. Page 177. Yeah, I gotta figure out a way to make that stop happening. There we go. Ooh, a little chilly tonight. All right, my fault, y'all. Trying to gotta find the right place to put my hands so my hands stay warm. Chapter 11, Looking Forward, Looking Back. From 1957 to 1968, Congress adopted civil rights laws prohibiting second-class citizenship for African Americans in public accommodations and transportation, voting, and employment. Although not without challenges, these laws were effective. Ending segregation in housing, however, is much more complicated. Prohibiting discrimination in voting in restaurants mostly requires modifying future behavior. But ending de jure segregation of housing requires undoing past actions that may seem irreversible. President Kennedy's 1962 executive order attempted to end the financing of residential segregation by federal agencies. In 1966, President Lyndon Johnson pushed to have a housing discrimination bill passed, but in a rare legislative defeat, the Senate killed his proposal. 2 years later, civil rights advocates tried again, and this time the Senate eked out by the narrowest of margins a Fair Housing Act that prohibited private discrimination in housing sales and rentals. Shortly after, pressured by national emotion following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, the House of Representatives enacted the law. For the first time since 1883, when the Supreme Court rejected the Civil Rights Act's ban on housing discrimination, government endorsed the rights of African Americans to reside wherever they chose and could afford. This law is now a half-century old. You might think that 50 years would be long enough to erase the effects of government promotion of and support for segregation. But the public policies of yesterday still shape the racial landscape of today. Where other civil rights laws have fallen short, the failures have been in implementation and enforcement, not in concept. Their design was straightforward. If African Americans were permitted to vote freely, their political power would be no different from that of others. If discrimination were prohibited in hiring, it would take some years for African Americans to gain comparable seniority, but once they did so, their workplace status would be no longer inferior. Once we prohibited segregation in hotels and restaurants, patrons of any race could be served. Likewise, if segregation was abolished on buses and trains, passengers of both races can sit in any empty seat the next day. The past had no structural legacy. We could use the same buses and trains, and no gargantuan social engineering was needed to make the transition to integration. Ending school segregation was much harder, but how to achieve it was clear. Districts could revise local school attendance boundaries so that children of either race could attend their neighborhood schools, and districts could upgrade the lower quality schools that African Americans had attended so that all facilities would be equal. Certainly there was massive resistance after 1954. Certainly there was massive resistance after 1954 when the Supreme Court ordered the dismantling of separate black and white school systems, yet in principle, school desegregation in most locales was easy. And if achieving it the next day was politically difficult, the time required should have been a matter of years, not decades. Unlike desegregating housing, desegregating schools required not undoing the discrimination that previous generations received, but only practicing integration going forward. As it has turned out, schools are more segregated today than they were 40 years ago. But this is mostly because the neighborhoods in which schools are located are so segregated. In 1970, the typical African American student attended a school in which 32% of the students were white. By 2010, this exposure had fallen to 29%. It is because of neighborhood segregation that African American students are more segregated in schools in states like New York and Illinois than they are anywhere else. Okay, so again, we like to relate everything that we're reading back to us specifically, and this is the this is the first portion that I am personally taking part in reading of this book. Well, I read a few pages in lieu of, or in a sort of like I got tagged in for a few pages for somebody, so I have read some from here currently on the today. However, I have read this entire book in the past. And one of the things that did stand out to me very much was how often Illinois is mentioned. And with Rockford being, I believe at this moment, the third biggest city in Illinois, the governor just said that Rockford felt like his second home. Rockford is a very much part of the makeup of Illinois. Rockford is not an aberration from the society, the society of Illinois, or the mindset, or the philosophy, or the ideology of Illinoisians or Illinoisans or whatever. So these things, when it says, it is because neighborhood segregation that African American students are more segregated in schools in states like New York and Illinois than they are in anywhere else. That relates to Rockford. You know, I know that Ari mentioned the People Who Cares versus the Rockford Public School Act or case, and that is a very important thing to keep in mind. I believe in that lawsuit it says something about Rockford having one of the most segregated school systems in the history of America. And so we have to remember that these things are not just arbitrary facts or arbitrary stories or information that we're getting from this time that's so far removed from us and from this place that's so far removed from us. These things are, it's important to understand these things for looking back and looking forward, not just for America as a nation, but for us in Rockford specifically. in Illinois specifically. Throughout the country, not just in the South, busing of school children was almost the only tool available to create integrated schools because few children lived near enough to opposite race peers for any other approach to be feasible. Were housing segregation not pervasive, school desegregation would have been more successful. Yet unlike the progress we anticipated from other civil rights laws, we shouldn't have expected much to happen from a Fair Housing Act that allowed African Americans now to resettle in a white suburb. Moving from an urban apartment to a suburban home is incomparably more difficult than registering to vote, applying for a job, changing seats on a bus, sitting down in a restaurant, or even attending a neighborhood school. Residential segregation is hard to undo for several reasons. Reason number one, parents' economic status is commonly replicated in the next generation, so once government prevented African Americans from fully participating in the mid-20th century free labor market, depressed incomes became, for many, a multi-generational trait. Okay, and so then I think we have to, that's something that we have to keep in mind continuously throughout this week going forward, I believe, and retroactively thinking back on some of the things that we've read before where some of the reasons that crime is pervasive in some of these inner city communities and some of the reasons that these stereotypes and these stigmatizations and this propaganda has been able to be used is because of the lack of opportunities and the lack of access to what you would maybe call legal avenues of generating revenue were open to black people. The lack of them that were open, the lack of them that were open not just for one generation or two generations, but for 3, 4, 5 generations, and that has now carried over to once you get to the 7th, 8th, or 9th generation of the descendants of slaves in America. It's carried over these things. So like when people, there's like this thing where black people don't like to work or black people are lazy. A lot of those stereotypes came into place because black people were not allowed to work, because black people were not allowed to have employment because of the color of their skin, nothing else, not because of the character of them personally, not because of the heart or any of those things, but because the color of their skin, they were denied access to participate in what is called the American dream. And that has continued on for years, and it has kept people stuck in the class in which they were born in. You know, people born in lower classes. I don't know if it speaks about it in this book or not, but when you're born in lower class, it's unlikely you will die in middle class. When you're born in middle class, it's unlikely you'll die in upper class. You die in upper class, it's unlikely you'll die. You're born in upper class, it's unlikely you'll die in middle or lower class. And so a lot of us do become prisoners of our circumstances. And America laid out the original circumstances for black people. The value of white working and middle class families' suburban housing appreciated substantially over the years. Reason number 2. The value of white working and middle class families' suburban housing appreciated substantially over the years, resulting in vast wealth differences between whites and blacks that help to define permanently our racial living arrangements. Because parents can bequeath assets to their children, the racial wealth gap is even more persistent down through the generations than income differences. Okay, so think about that. I don't want to go into too deep a tangents on all these things, but really just think about what they're saying there. What they're saying basically is that not only in laying the original foundation and the original groundwork of the parameters of opportunities in America for black people, not only did they do that the first time around, and not only does that have great implications on generations to come forward, but they're saying that because of the wealth that families generated when these things were happening, because of the fact that they were, let's say, white people were being allowed 50% more often to be able to find a job and to find employment, which made them 80% more likely to be able to start owning assets, like owning their cars and owning their homes and owning businesses and owning property. And then also the places where they're owning these things and owning these businesses and property and these homes, black people are not allowed to do those things. So as these homes become worth more money, or an antique car or something like that, or property, building property, as these things become worth more money, black people are not even being allowed to participate in buying something and investing in something and letting it become more. So not only are they not being allowed to participate in a single generation of family having more opportunities and having more money, they're not being allowed to participate in the opportunity for generational wealth, for investing. And being denied that opportunity, they are saying, had greater implications, because there's an argument to be made that the people who benefited the most off of family owning a home in 1920 was maybe that generation's descendants in 1970 and 1980, which is very feasible. Reason number 3. We waited too long to try to undo it. By the time labor market discrimination abated sufficiently for substantial numbers of African Americans to reach for the middle class, homes outside of urban black neighborhoods had mostly become unaffordable for working and lower middle class families. So that gets us into one of the things that we spoke about. This book is very heavy on the concept of justice too long delayed is justice denied. And that's right here. It goes the same way. Opportunity too long delayed is opportunity denied. Damn. Denied. Damn. I just thought about something. The books. I don't got the books. Damn, no. Damn. I gotta message somebody. Oh, no, I do got the book. It's cast. Damn, my fault. I'm tweaking. My fault, y'all. See? I'm just trying to make sure. We done had a couple close calls. We 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 had a couple close calls with books. My fault. Okay, my fault. Damn. I'm getting distracted. Damn, I'm not supposed to be getting distracted. Okay. I was real. Yeah, where is it? It's somewhere. We got it. It's good. We got it. Okay, my fault, y'all. Damn. Okay, let's get back to business. Reason number 3. Once segregation was established, seemingly race-neutral Reason number 3. Once segregation was established, seemingly race-neutral policies reinforced it to make remedies even more difficult. Perhaps most pernicious has been the federal tax code's mortgage interest deduction, which increased the subsidies to higher-income suburban homeowners while providing no corresponding tax benefit for renters. Because the jure policies of segregation ensured that whites would likely be owners and African Americans more likely to be renters, the tax code contributes to making African Americans and white less equal, despite the code's purportedly non-racial provisions. Okay, so let's I'm gonna go through that one more time. Once segregation was established, seemingly race-neutral policies reinforced it to make remedies even more difficult. Seemingly race-neutral policies. That's one of the things that Michelle Alexander spoke about. This idea of this myth of us entering into a colorblind time and a colorblind policies, which in fact actually them being purported to be colorblind made them lack equity, because which is the difference between equality and equity, which is what they're. So a lot of the point of this is that so many things have been done already. You can't simply just say, well, we're going to stop doing that going forward. You have to now begin to do the work of trying to undo these things and trying to remedy these things. And so They're basically, excuse me, perhaps most pernicious has been the federal tax code's mortgage interest deduction, which increased the subsidies to higher income suburban homeowners while providing no corresponding tax benefit for renters. So people who own their home were getting benefits and were getting subsidies, while people who were renting were getting nothing. And for years, only people allowed to truly own homes were white people, and black people had to be renters. So even though this was purported to be race neutral, it was highly in favor of white people. Reason number 5. Contemporary federal, state, and local programs have reinforced residential segregation rather than diminished it. Federal subsidies for low-income families' housing have been used mainly to support those families' ability to rent apartments in minority areas where economic opportunity is scarce, not in integrated neighborhoods. Likewise, developers of low-income housing have used federal tax credits mostly to construct apartments in already segregated neighborhoods. Even half a century after government ceased to promote segregation explicitly, it continues to promote it implicitly, every year making remedial action more difficult. So what they're saying in this one is that the government subsidies, money that the government was giving to people who were trying to do things to help low-income family housing, they've only continued to put those things in areas where they have already relegated to black people and withdrew resources from and made them basically areas that were poor. Poor areas, but they made them areas that were segregated, and because in segregating the areas became kept up not as well, because they were not maintenance as well. They became basically ghettos and slums, and so they're saying that even though money is now being given to the government to try to help people who need more low-income housing, the low-income housing continues to be built in areas of other low-income housing. So, and that low-income housing was already built in that area based on segregation. So some of these things that are being done are just lending towards getting us deeper and deeper into segregation. Part 1. From the end of World War II until about 1973, the real wages and family incomes of all working and middle-class Americans grew rapidly, nearly doubling. African Americans, however, experienced the biggest growth toward the end of that period. In the 1960s, the income gap between them and white workers narrowed somewhat. The incomes of African American janitors and white production workers grew at the same pace, and the gap between them didn't much narrow, but more African Americans who previously would have been unemployed, who would have previously only been employed as janitors, were hired as production workers, and they made gradual progress into better jobs in the skilled trades, at least in unionized industry. African Americans remain mostly excluded, however, from highly paid blue-collar occupations. The construction trades, for example. In most government jobs, teaching, the federal civil service, state, and municipal government, but not in all, African Americans made progress. They were hired in city sanitation departments, for example, but rarely as firefighters. Overall, African American incomes didn't take off until the 1960s, when suburbanization was mostly complete. From 1973 until the present, real wages of working and middle-class Americans of all races and ethnicities have been mostly stagnant. For those with only high school educations, or perhaps some college, real earnings declined, as production workers with unionized factory jobs were laid off and found employment in service occupations where the absence of unions meant wages would be much lower. Okay. Just as the income of all... Okay, I'm sorry, y'all. I'm just... sometimes I work through it as I'm reading, too. So I was just working through that, just thinking about that. Just as the income of all working-class Americans, white and black, began to stagnate, single-family home prices began to soar. From 1973 to 1980, the African-American median wage fell by 1%, while the average American house price grew by 43%. In the next decade, wages of African American workers fell by another percent, while the average house price increased yet another 8%. By the time the federal government decided to allow African Americans into the suburbs, By the time the federal government decided to finally allow African Americans into the suburbs, the window of opportunity for an integrated nation had mostly closed. In 1948, for example, Leviton homes sold for about $8,000 and about $70,000 in today's, in 1948, for example, Leviton homes sold for about $8,000 or about $75,000 in today's dollars. Now, properties in Leviton without major remodeling, i.e. one bathhouses, sell for $350,000 and up. White working class families who bought those homes in 1948 have gained, over 3 generations, more than $200,000 in wealth. So that lets you know how much opportunity for people, especially when we start talking about what a capitalistic society is and how capitalism and racism is intertwined. You start to see what American capitalism looks like. Is this open opportunity? Was it an open opportunity, equal opportunity to develop wealth in this time? And then that wealth still has implications today. Most African American families who were denied the opportunity to buy into Leviton or into the thousands of subdivisions like it across the country remain renters, often in depressed neighborhoods, and gain no equity. Others bought into less desirable neighborhoods. Vince Meriday, who helped build Leviton but was prohibited from living there, bought a home in the nearby, almost all-black suburb of Lakeview. It remains 74% African American today. His relatives can't say precisely what he paid for his Lakeview house in 1948, but with Leviton being the least expensive, best bargain of the time, it was probably no less than the $75,000 he would have paid in Leviton. Although white suburban borrowers could obtain VA mortgages with no down payments, Vince Meriday could not because he was African American. He would have had to make a down payment, probably about 20% or $15,000. One-bath homes in Lakeview currently sell for $90,000 to $120,000. At most, the Meriday family gained $45,000 in equity appreciation over 3 generations, perhaps 20% of the wealth gained by white veterans in Leviton. Making matters worse, it was lower-middle-class African-American communities like Lakeview that mortgage brokers targeted for subprime lending during the pre-2008 housing bubble, leaving many more African-American families subject to default and foreclosure than economically similar white families. 70 years ago, many working and lower-middle-class African-American families could have afforded suburban single-family homes that cost about $75,000 in today's currency, with no down payment. Millions of whites did so. But working and lower-middle-class African-American families cannot now buy homes for $350,000 and more with down payments of 20% or $70,000. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited future discrimination, but it was not primarily discrimination, although this still contributed, that kept African Americans out of most white suburbs after the law was passed. It was primarily unaffordability. The right that was unconstitutionally denied to African Americans in the late 1940s cannot be restored by passing a fair housing law that tells their descendants they can now buy homes in the suburbs if only they can afford it. The advantage that FHA and VA loans gave the white lower middle class in the 1940s and 50s has become permanent. Part 2. The reduction of discriminatory barriers in the labor market that began in the mid-20th century did not translate easily into African Americans' upward mobility. Movement from lower ranks to the middle class and the national income distribution has always been difficult for all Americans. This reality challenges a fantasy we share, that children born into low-income families can themselves escape that status through hard work, responsibility, education, ambition, and a little luck. That myth is becoming less prevalent today as more Americans become aware of how sticky our social class positions are. Imagine that we lined up all American families in order of their incomes from highest to lowest and then divided that line into 5 equal groups. In discussions of mobility, this is the part I speak to people about this all the time. I can never remember exactly how it is. I'm going to remember this now. In discussions of mobility, it is usual to call the richest fifth the top or 5th quintile, the next richest fifth the 4th quintile, and so on. If we were fully an equal opportunity society, and no society is, children whose parents have incomes in the bottom quintile of the income distribution would have equal chances of having income as adults anywhere in that distribution. In other words, of children in the bottom quintile, 1/5 would remain as adults in that bottom quintile. Another fifth would have incomes in the fourth quintile. Another fifth would have climbed to the middle or third quintile. We can call this the middle class. Another fifth would rise to the second quintile, and another fifth would land in the top of the top quintile, having the highest incomes, the upper class. In fact, however, the United States has less mobility than many other industrialized societies. Of American children born to parents whose incomes were in the bottom income quintile, almost half, 43%, remain trapped in the bottom quintile as adults. Only 30% of children born to parents in the lowest earning quintile make it to the middle quintile or higher. African Americans have even less mobility. For those born to parents in the bottom income quintile, over half, 53%, remain there as adults, and only a quarter, 26%, make it to the middle quintile or higher. Considering the disadvantages that low-income African Americans have had as a result of segregation, poor access to jobs and to schools where they can excel, it's surprising that their mobility, compared to that of other Americans, isn't even lower. Two explanations come to mind. One is that many African Americans heed the warning that they have to be twice as good to succeed and exhibit more than average hard work, responsibility, and ambition to supplement a little luck. The other is that our affirmative action programs have been moderately successful. Probably some of both are involved. Let's see. Part 3. I'm going to just share this live real quick. If you're watching this, share this live. I should have went on my page and said, okay, my fault. I said this live. My fault, y'all. If you're watching this, go share this live. Go in here, sharing it live. I'm gonna pin it to the page. This phone dying. I need to charge it. Okay, 1 second. Okay, pin to top. Okay. Watch and share. Again, we're reading The Color of Law. Anybody that's just now tuning in, reading The Color of Law. This is part of the ongoing teaching at Say Their Name Square. My fault. Okay. Okay. All right, y'all. Okay. Let's pick back up. Part 3. Median white family income is now about $60,000, while median median white family income is now about $60,000, while median black family income is about $37,000, about 60% as much. You might expect that the ratio of black to white household wealth will be similar, but median white household wealth, assets minus liabilities, is about $134,000, while median black household wealth is about $11,000, less than 10% as much. Not all of this enormous difference is attributable to the government's racial housing policy, but a good portion of it certainly is. Equity that families have in their homes is the main source of wealth for middle class Americans. African American families today, whose parents and grandparents were denied participation in the equity accumulating boom of the 1950s and 1960s, have great difficulty catching up now. As with income, there is little mobility by wealth in America. In fact, intergenerational wealth mobility is even less than intergenerational income mobility. An equal opportunity society with respect to wealth would operate similarly to an equal opportunity society with respect to income. No matter how wealthy your parents, you would have an equal chance as an adult of ending up anywhere in the national wealth distribution. But nearly half, 41%, of children born to parents in the least wealthy fifth of American families remain in that lowest quintile as adults. Another 25% make it to the next lowest wealthy, another 25% make it to the next lowest wealth quintile, meaning that only 1/3 of children born to the least wealthy American families make it as high as the middle quintile in wealth. As is true with income, African Americans are also less mobile in wealth than whites. Fewer than 1/4 of African American adults whose parents were in the bottom wealth quintile make it to the middle wealth quintile. Nearly twice as many, 42%, white adults whose parents were in the lowest wealth quintile make it that far. Since African Americans were mostly prevented by government racial policy from owning single-family homes in the suburbs, it is not surprising that this will be so. This difference becomes especially significant in that white families are more often able to borrow from their home equity, if necessary, to weather medical emergencies, send their children to college, retire without becoming dependent on those children, aid family members experiencing hard times, or endure brief periods of joblessness without fearing of losing a home or going hungry. If none of these emergencies consume their savings or home equity, families can bequeath the wealth to the next generation. And so right there, that's just another, them going deeper into the wealth gap and going deeper into, my fault, y'all. Going deeper into the implications that the wealth gap has. And I think that it's important that, I'll do something on here real quick. I think it's important that we do point out these gaps, and that we do state that these are still hindrances to this day. These are still things that we deal with today. We still deal with these, and that's what he is saying. We still deal with these implications today. So I think that my fault. I'm getting distracted. Okay, my fault. I'm getting distracted. My fault. But I'm trying to. I'll be trying to share the. I'll be trying to share the videos on the page. Make sure that people see that we live. So that is what I'm doing right now. I'm not. Anyways, but I think that that portion right there was pointing out how these issues have stayed relevant and how important it was back then. You know, when we live in this capitalistic society, when we live in a society that is dominated by money and dominated by wealth and power is sometimes determined by how much money you can exert, and influence is about how much money you can exert on certain situations. When we see that black people were consistently being denied the opportunity to build money, the opportunity to build wealth, the opportunity to build power, it explains why we have gotten into these situations. If you don't understand, by the end of this week, between last week, the last 7 days, really, in my opinion, did a good job of laying out the landscape of that we are currently in, as far as policing and law enforcement, and how we got to that landscape as far as policing and law enforcement. But policing and law enforcement and prisons and crime, those are all effects. These are all effects. But the root causes are what we are looking at this week. And I think that as we go through and read these things, we can start to have these dialogues in an honest, transparent, and truthful, and informative manner about some of these issues better. And this is just telling you, just letting you see the denial of black people and to be able to build power, to be able to build influence, build wealth. This difference becomes especially significant in that white families are more often able to. Oh no, I went through that. In 1989, the most recent year for which such data is available. My fault. For 1989, the most recent year for which such data was available, 6% of black households inherited wealth from the previous generation. All right, my fault. Dang, tripping. Of those who inherited wealth, the average inheritance was $42,000. 4 times as many white households, 24%, inherited wealth, and the average inheritance was $145,000. In that year, 18% of black households received cash gifts from parents who were still living in for multiple generations in poor neighborhoods. Patrick Sharkey, a New York University sociologist, analyzed data on race and neighborhood conditions and reported his findings in the 2000s as typical for whites, but in aberration